I invite you, if you're joining us for this beautiful session, to go ahead and take a seat. You are very, very welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Rebecca Brierley, and I am the Community Reconciliation Program Manager here at St. Ethelburga's. I've been here for about 7 years. And I come from quite a traditional Christian background. And when I arrived here 7 years ago at St. Ethelburga's, I had never heard the term spiritual ecology. That was a brand new language to me then. And so I kind of went on a personal quest to educate myself and to understand what that word meant. And in my seeking inspiration, wisdom, and education, I came across this incredible man seated next to me called Alastair McIntosh. And I read a book called Soil and Soul that was one of those aha, penny drop moments where lots of different themes that I had heard and studied wove together and created this beautiful definition and exploration of what spiritual ecology actually meant. So this really does feel like you've all kind of crashed my living room because this is a dream moment for me. I've met Alastair in person a few times before, but this was always one of my dreams when I read that book. What would it be like to have the opportunity to actually ask my questions to Alastair in person? So this is genuinely a dream moment. Excuse me while I fangirl a little bit. So you're welcome here into this conversation. So for those of you who don't know, Alastair McIntosh, he is an author and activist and one of Scotland's leading voices on land reform and ecology and spiritual renewal. He is best known for one of his books. He's written many, Soil and Soul, which is my personal favorite. And his work really bridges the divides between environmental justice and cultural identity and the deeper moral and spiritual roots of social change. And so we are here today to talk about Christian spiritual ecology, but please do give a warm welcome to Alastair McIntosh. So I have about 8 questions. That's my plan. Alastair assures me it won't go to plan. And so I am willing to go where it takes us. And I, of course, want to leave some time to offer it to questions as well from you. Alastair, welcome.
Thank you, Becca. And so nice to see you after we met on Iona last year. Can I just say to people, the reason I'm wandering around with my phone and will be tinkering with it is... can I just say that the reason I'm wandering around with my phone and will be tinkering with it is that I'm profoundly deaf and I've got special microphone setups to help me to hear. Similarly, if I'm speaking with you, I might ask to fit a mic onto you because of the noise in the background. So just to explain. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes,
and so go for it.
I have a very beautiful necklace here that he's given me.
Yeah, you got a backup
just
in case.
Thank you. Yeah, that's right. The last time we saw each other, we were marveling at the Aurora Borealis in Iona, the island of Iona, which was incredible to be there for that. Alastair, my first question. So this conference centers on spiritual ecology. So as a Christian, you who grew up in the Hebrides in Scotland, within an indigenous community, and as someone who spent 4 years living in Papua New Guinea, what does that term mean to you?
Well, you say, as a Christian, I would like to qualify that by saying it depends what you mean by that. And my Christian approach is very interfaith. It's been profoundly informed by other faiths, particularly mystical traditions. So just to say that. But what does spiritual ecology mean to me? To me, it means an understanding of the wholeness that we are part of. The Russian playwright Maxim Gorky said, "We are all pilgrims of the earth, and I've heard it said that the earth itself is a pilgrim in the heavens. So it's about the whole shebang. It's about understanding what it means to be a human being in full cosmological context.
I love that. Full cosmological context. And as you alluded to, there are many different theologies of Christianity, and there's many different Christian theologies of earth. And so, for example, on one end you would have young earth creationism, and on the other side you would have Christian animism. So what is your theology of earth? If you could say a little bit more about that and what specifically has shaped it. You alluded to it, but I'd love to get into those details.
Well, when you mentioned the book Soil and Soul, when I was writing that in the late 1990s, I'd been kicked out of Edinburgh University because of the radical nature of the work on land reform and stopping a super quarry in the Isle of Harris. I'm from the Isle of Lewis, and the Isle of Harris is neighbouring it. And I was on an unemployment benefit because, you know, if you've been prominently kicked out of a university, as it was very prominent, including a New Scientist editorial in defense of what we were doing, you're kind of unemployable for a while. So I was cycling back from the unemployment sign-on one day, and the notion soil and soul came to me. And shortly afterwards, I was teaching a week at Schumacher College, and I was discussing this with Satish Kumar, and he said you could add a third to that and make it Soil, Soul and Society, which is a title of one of his recent books. And so soil, you know, what is spiritual ecology? It's about the soil. It's about our relationship with the earth. It's about soul. It's about our spiritual relationship with the divine. And society, it's about our relationship with each other. And I see that triune of soil, soul, and society as being the fullness of the meaning of the word community.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And so you mentioned there some about your Celtic roots, and you've talked about how your Celtic tradition has informed much of what you've done. I find that there's often a tension between maybe organized religion, more traditional faiths, and the broader spiritual ecology movement, because it does often lean towards pluralism or earth-based spirituality. So I'm curious about how you see the Celtic tradition specifically potentially being a bridge between those two worlds of more traditional faiths and the spiritual ecology movement.
Okay, well, I think first of all, you know, most of us are mixtures. We're not just Celtic or Sudanese or whatever it is. Most of us are mongrels these days. So I would like to acknowledge I'm born of an English mother. I was born in Doncaster, where my Scottish father, after graduating in medicine from Edinburgh University just after the Second World War, met my mother, who was a nursing sister. And it was when I was 4 years old, we moved up to the Isle of Lewis. And it was actually many years later, it was actually while I was writing Soil and Soul, that a relative contacted me who'd been doing the genealogy and said, do you know really what your background is? And I didn't. And so it was a process of retrospective discovery that then started to make a lot of sense in terms of just how I felt about things. I don't need to go into here what that was, except perhaps to say that my twice great-grandfather was an eminent singer in the old tradition of the Gaelic Psalms, wow, which in turn had come out of the Bardic tradition. So it was that kind of background that opened up. And I had long felt an attraction to Celtic spirituality. Now, what is that? Because it's a highly contested term, as I'm sure our Irish friend will be well aware, that in the late 1980s, in response, I think, to overkill in terms of trite interpretations, shallow interpretations of what it was about, a group of scholars such as Patrick Sim-Williams in Wales and Professor Donald Meek in Edinburgh led what has become known as the Celto-skeptic movement. In other words, skepticism that there is anything particularly environmental or feminine or anything like that about the Celtic tradition. Now, in my view, this is a bit of an unholy alliance between evangelical outlooks, which feel threatened by mysticism and spirituality. They want a regimented type of religiosity. And secular academics who are equally discomforted by spirituality and mysticism as a deeper expression of spirituality. It's done a lot of harm. I mean, did some necessary good, because there was this shallow sense of taking the bells and smells, the beautiful stuff that's in the Celtic. I could see we would have a good conversation about this. I'm so deaf, I didn't pick up your name, but want to talk to you more if we get a chance later. The sense of, well, I put it to Donald Meek like this. In 2013, I was at a conference in St. Columba in my home island of my adopted home island of Lewis, where I grew up. And I said to Donald, what is it, Donald, with you Celto-skeptics, It's like you've been so helpful in my work. You've been so generous in the way you responded to soil and soul, etc. And yet the lecture you have just given this evening, making out there is no such thing as a Celtic environmentalism. How can you say that in the light of your predecessor in the chair of Celtic at Edinburgh University, Professor Jackson, Kenneth Hulston Jackson, with his books such as Celtic Miscellany, still in print from Penguin Classics, or for those of you who are Welsh particularly, his less well-known book on early Celtic nature writing, which you can still pick up second-hand and has a particularly Welsh emphasis. How can you say that kind of thing? And he said, oh, well, Alastair, oh, well. And I said, well, tell me, Donald, is it like this? Because you're from Tyree, where there's been such an upheaval caused by the power of landlordism, people being evicted off the land, and then today, so many houses, anywhere that's beautiful, taken over by holidaymakers, second homes, Airbnb, that kind of stuff. I know a village in Lewis, Garranin, where when I was there a number of years ago, an old man, Callum MacDonald, said to me, we are the only indigenous family until you get 8 houses up the street. And now, even that gone. I said, is it, Donald, that you are feeling such grief at the loss of your indigenous culture? That, as Duncan Ferguson on the Isle of Egg said, as Duncan said about the same situation, I'd rather see the whole ship go down than to stay afloat with those buggers on board. And I sometimes think this is why you'll find, in some areas, it's the indigenous people who are in favour of blots on the landscape, of big wind farms, or the super quarry in the case of Howes. Because they're already hurting so much in ways that perhaps the holidaymakers don't realise, or the retirees don't realise. They're hurting so much at the way their community has become full of black holes, of houses where the lights don't even need to come on in midsummer. But at night, there's no lights on in the house. That they just want to cut off from it. And I think that explains quite a lot of that Celtic skeptic stuff. And this is why I was so happy to hear what we heard earlier about how in Ireland, St. Bridget's Day, St. Bride, Bríde, the Celtic mother goddess, come Christian saint, is being celebrated so much. We also in Glasgow, we always mark St. Bride's Day with the sacred fire. And I celebrate that coming back. And of course, it's coming back differently now because we are all a mongrel nation now. In Scotland, we speak of one Scotland, many cultures. So part of the challenge is how do you bring the folk who come into what it means to be Indigenous?
So with your tradition, with your various theologies of earth that were shaped early on, and because you're so fascinating, Alastair, because you also have a love for myth and poetry and story and art. So I'd love to explore a little bit about the power that you see those having as well, but where also your environmental activism came from. So what was it in your shaping that led you to see both the power of story and myth, as you described, but also that led you to want to act in those very practical ways?
Well, it's interesting. You see, in many ways, we had a quite utilitarian relationship with our environment. The spiritual backdrop was there in the Presbyterian tradition. I'm a Quaker these days, but I've got, raised in the Presbyterian tradition. You've got the Westminster Shorter Catechism, which came out of Dutch Calvinism. And question 8 is, how doth God execute his decrees? To which the answer is, God executeth his decrees in the works of creation and providence. Now that's actually profoundly ecological. The works of creation, that's a kickstart, that's a big bang, that's a getting it going. Providence, providence, that's the ongoing process theology. So although that was there, nevertheless, nature was so bountiful where we were. We didn't really think of it as something separate. We were just immersed in it. We'd be digging and cutting the peats and bringing them home. Somebody gave me a telling off for that the other day and said, "Oh, you shouldn't be doing that." And I said, "I'm talking about the indigenous way of doing it, where it's part of our life." Yeah. I would always be in and out of boats, either in the freshwater lochs or the sea, mucking out the byre. I was telling somebody the other day how, as kids, when we'd be sledging and we'd get frozen cold, I noticed that my midden, my dung heap from the cow's manure, the blackbirds were nestling down in the snow to get to the warmth. And so I found that if I rolled up my sleeves and thrust my arms down into the dung heap, it was really hot inside. And of course, you come out covered in shit, but it's clean shit. Now, so we had that, nature was, it was what nourished us, it was what fed us. We didn't think of it as being something apart. And our primary concern was for the community, for people. You go to my island and people, you'll see so many indigenous people and people who've become indigenous to the place say, "Oh, I'm doing it for the community." That kind of language, for the community, for the community. And I went out to Papua New Guinea with voluntary service overseas in 1977, where I was initially teaching, and then I was wiring up small-scale hydroelectric schemes. And it was while I was there that I was challenged by Papua New Guineans saying, where are your trees? And look at photographs of the island. Why don't you have any trees when you're telling us it's good to have forests here? Where are your forests? And I said, well, we don't own any land. And I'm thinking here of a woman, Mama Miriam, who said to me, "But how can you not own land? We thought that all you white people were rich. How can you be rich when you don't own any land?" And I said, well, the landowners have got it all. And at that time in law, if you planted trees, they belong to the landowner, not to the crofter, to the tenant farmer who was on it. And it was only gradually as I came back from Papua New Guinea after a second time out there in the 1980s that my focus started to widen from a purely social concern into environmental concern, coming back home into the land reform debate, but also the proposal to turn the highest mountain in the south of the Isle of Harris into what would have been the biggest roadstone quarry in the world, which got me involved in that battle. And that started to open up the issue of environment as well. So I would have to say that I'm still somebody whose primary thrust is towards people.
We are going to get there.
We're going to get there.
Yes, we are. I promise.
I'll hold back.
We are going to get there. I just want to stick with the land a little bit because you started to talk about land reform.
By the way, I don't
Yes.
know my own volume because of my hearing aid. So
It's
am
good.
I all
You're great,
okay?
and
Yeah,
James
good.
is
Thank you.
on it, so yeah, we're good. Okay, so in Soil and Soul, that's where you were writing about this interconnection between land, community, and spirit, and you were talking about the work on the Isle of Egg. Is that
Egg, yeah.
Egg, yeah.
Egg.
And how that helped to inspire the community land reform work that you were doing in Scotland. So how did you see that land reform being a version of sacred activism?
Sacred activism.
As in connect the dots for me. So you said you came back from Papua New Guinea and you were passionate about the environment and you felt called to join in that work of land reform. And so how did you see that as part of your sacred activism? And also I'd love to understand how you're thinking of, soil, soul, and society, how that's evolved. Because you wrote the book 20 years ago?
24 years ago.
Yeah, 24 years ago.
Well, I was hugely fortunate. You see, I was brought up in a heavily conservative evangelical community. Free Church of Scotland, you might have heard of the Wee Frees, that kind of context. And from quite an early age, I rejected all of that. It's hardline Calvinist religion. It took me some time, really only in recent years, to really understand the full spirituality of the people, because the overlay of heavy-duty religion was so heavy on it. But I now understand that underneath that heavy-duty overlay, it's a bit like with Irish Catholicism, underneath it, you get this profound spirituality of community, of love in the people. And I now realize that I was raised in a spiritual community. But it was a necessary step to pull away from it. Most of us growing up then, those of us who were kids in the 1960s, we wanted to get out of the island. In fact, you hadn't really made anything of yourself unless you got on and get out. I went right to the other side of the world, to Papua New Guinea.
Yeah.
And where was it that, can you imagine coming out of the highly Presbyterian Isle of Lewis and being told, in which the Westminster Confession has it, that the Pope is the son of perdition, the son of sin, and being told, well, Alastair, how about we post you to a Catholic mission in Papua New Guinea, headed up by a retired Australian Archbishop, Virgil Patrick Coopers, and 4 Mother Teresa Missionary of Charity nuns. So I said, great, I'm all for it, as long as I don't have to go to Mass and all the rest of it. Well, what an experience, because the bishop was a deeply saintly man. When I went to see him in the evening, I worked very closely with him. Every day I would spend time in silence, just every afternoon, having a cup of tea, mostly in silence with him. When I'd go to see him in the evening, I'd have to step around the bodies of homeless people who were all over the floor of his so-called archiepiscopal palace in Kerema, Gulf Province, one of the most hard-pressed parts of Papua New Guinea. And for all that he was quite conservative in his theology, he was a great admirer of Vatican II, that reforming process. And so that introduction, if you like, to liberation theology came from there. I then came back to Scotland. I did I needed to make myself more useful. I did an MBA at Edinburgh University in 1980. And then in 1990, I ended up teaching human ecology at Edinburgh University. And one day the phone went, and it was John Harvey, the leader of the Iona community, and he said, Alastair, I'm sending Tom Forsyth, a crofter from the Highlands, to see you, because he's got this crazy idea to bring egg into community ownership. But I don't think it's that crazy. I think it's important. Give him a hearing. So Tom came through, and here was this man deeply rooted in the land, in trees, in simple farming and fishing, and deeply rooted in all of that. And his vision was not just for the environment and not just for the community, it was also spiritual. He would come out with lines from the Bible like, unless the Lord builds a house, they labor in vain that build it. Or the cornerstone that the builders have rejected is the stone that builds the house, or something like that. He would come out with that kind of stuff all the time. And what that did is as we started the Egg Trust in 1991, just 4 of us as founding trustees, was the objective that we were going to challenge landed power. The island was on the market per necessity because of the multiple divorces of the owner, meaning he had to, by court order, sell the island to realize assets. And we figured that if we pitched a community claim of right, we would have the effect of market spoiling. We would have the effect of scaring off mainstream buyers by showing that the natives were restless and there was a little bit of trouble up country. You can see, learning from the experience in places like Papua New Guinea. Yeah. And basically over the course of a 6-year campaign, during which we raised £1.6 million, we reached a point where we were able to buy out the island for roughly half of what the owner had hoped to get for it.
Amazing.
And the place is now entirely self-governed. The trust is held by the people. They elect each other to be trustees. They have their own entirely renewable electricity grid, because being 14 miles out to sea, they're off-grid. There's over 100 people living there, all kinds of eco-housing, small businesses, tree nurseries that now export to other islands round about, and so on. It's incredible what's been achieved, but more than that, we moved it through in 2003 to land reform in the new Scottish Parliament, and we now have some 500 land trusts in Scotland, covering very nearly 3% of Scotland's 19 million acres.
Amazing.
And these places are patterns and examples. They are patterns, they are a theory of change, and examples, case studies of change that show the kind of energy that can be released in community when people are able to rise to the responsibility of governing their own place, not for the benefit of extracting wealth, but for the benefit of nourishing, of following through creation with the works of providence.
That's so beautiful. I want to allow some people from the audience to ask a question. I know you're passionate also about talking about humans. And so I want to ask this question to you. So Christianity in its Western form has often been critiqued for being an anthropocentric religion, and various different theologies will have various interpretations of the Bible and the order of things. But you've often emphasized that environmental justice must go hand in hand with social justice. And so for you, what does flourishing look like in the 21st century?
What look like?
Flourishing.
Flourishing.
Yeah, for both humans and the earth. What does that look like?
No.
And you might want to, I know you did a lot of work, your early work in Glasgow's housing schemes as well, which potentially shaped that.
For the past 21 years, my wife and I have lived in Govan, which is a hard-pressed area of Glasgow. And we were invited to do there by initially a group of motorway protesters, people from the local community, who said to me, It's all very well, Alastair, doing your work in beautiful little Scottish islands, but what about us in inner city native reservations?
Yeah.
So, the Galgale Trust, we focus our work around building boats and getting people out onto the River Clyde or into the sea, woodworking workshops, in fact, every kind of craft workshops going on. We have a community garden, we have a community meal every week. And we call it the Galgale. It's a term that came up in the 9th century in Scotland, where there was a lot of Norse blood intermixing with the Gaelic Hebridean blood. And so the Galgale meant the Gael is a stranger. The Gael are the heartland people. The Galgale is a strange or foreign Gaels. And Colin MacLeod, whose idea it was to use that name and asked me to check it out at the university to see if it was valid, Colin said, well, that's what we are now. There's a bit of the stranger, a bit of the heartland people in us all. But on that point you just raised about the Christian in it, can I just draw people's attention, if I can just move down here so I can see it myself, can I draw people's attention to what we are actually looking at in this sacred natural site right here? Because I'm given to understand that this was made using some of the glass's fragments from when the bomb went off, that it is what has been resurrected out of the violence that was expressed here. Hence, perhaps, the inscription from the Psalms here, "Oh, pray for the peace of Jerusalem," because unless there is peace in Jerusalem, how can there be peace amongst the three Abrahamic faiths that are expressed there today? But look at what we're looking at there, because to me that totally sums up, that icon of spiritual painting of St. Ethelburga totally sums up what we are talking about in terms of spiritual activism and what makes it spiritual activism as distinct from secular activism. Because there she is, in her left hand she's bearing a shepherd's crook, a bishop's crozier, whatever it's called. She's leading a flock, but she's not leading it from a place of ego. In the tradition of St. Ethelburga, she was moved towards her work amongst the poor, eventually dying from plague herself in the 7th century. She was moved to that after she saw a brilliant light of God that filled her and changed her life. And so she's looking up towards the light there, but she's also got a hand reaching out. It's not coming from the me. It's not even coming from the we. It's coming from God that she's reaching in. And what is she drawing towards her? This is my interpretation just from sitting here this morning watching it. There's a kind of sense of flow coming through her hands. And if you look in the second panel there from the left up at the top, you see a kind of building structure and something flowing from that. I suspect that that is drawing on the end of the book of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel has this incredible vision which is then replicated right at the end of the New Testament in the book of Revelation, of the river flowing from underneath the threshold of the temple. And as the river flows out into the land, it feeds trees on both sides of the bank, not just our side, but on both sides of the bank. The leaves of which, and notice the leaves on the left there, and notice the leaves along the bottom panels there, the leaves of which are for the healing of the nations. And so there, you've got a sermon in glass, which I think kind of says it all. You were mentioning Bridget's mantle and the old goddess tradition that when St. Bride's Day comes, the mantle is taken off and spread across the world. In St. Adamnan's account of St. Columba's nativity, we're told that Ethne, his mother, before he was born, had a vision of an angel holding a beautiful cloak made of all the colors of the flowers of the field. And she reached out to take the cloak, but the angel drew it back from her and said, "My lady, You cannot hold on to this. You must allow it to do the work of God. And as the angel moved back and back, Adamnan, writing round about 698 or thereabouts, Adamnan says that the cloak expanded and expanded until it covered all the mountains and forests and oceans of the whole world. That is the holiness that we are talking about. That is the kind of vision of the Spirit of God, that water flowing from out of the temple, that you'll also find, for example, in chapter 9 of the Bhagavad Gita, in the Hindu tradition, and so on, because what you're looking at there, and this is the importance of the saints. Don't tell my Presbyterian friends I said that, but this is the importance of the saints. They represent archetypal principles. What you see in that window in front of you is a universal truth that you're looking at that could make sense in many cultures of the world.
Beautiful. Thank you for drawing our attention to her as well. We just have a few moments, and I would just love to see if there are any questions from the audience. Yes, right here.
Oh, yeah. What do you think about this idea of God in nature and nature in God, and the idea that what we do actually changes God? So rather than God being a kind of thing outside of nature that just sort of enacts creation and we play to his or her tune, that actually we're part of that and we actually create, and that God changes because of us, and there's this sort of relationship.
I think it's hugely important and hardly understood by mainstream religion. Partly you're talking about the distinction there between pantheism, the idea that God is nature, and panentheism, the idea that God is present, that God permeates nature. And the Christian theological perspective is panentheistic, as distinct from pantheistic. And I'm very comfortable with that. I'm very comfortable with the idea that, well, as the Bhagavad Gita puts it so beautifully, my whole being unfolds in this, and yet I am not it, yet it is in me. The Bhagavad Gita is the most sacred text in Hinduism. I'm quoting there roughly from chapter 9 and thereabouts. Is hugely clear on that. But I think you raise a very important point that I've been meditating a lot in the context of that weird statement at the end of the Lord's Prayer, but lead us not into temptation. Now, why should God lead us into temptation? As my French Protestant mother-in-law, Huguenot mother-in-law, puts it, her take is that you have in Deuteronomy God setting before us, God setting before Moses, I set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life. In other words, we are being given the choice. We are not being told you must be good little children and carry on being obedient in the Garden of Eden. We are being given the choice so that we can grow into love, if we choose to grow into love. But moreover, and you've also touched beautifully on this point here, I think there's a sense in which God becomes what God is. And I'm talking metaphorically here, don't take this literally. God becomes a God in the fullness of eternity through the process of engagement with humankind in time. And one place where you see that very clearly in the Bible is where Abraham stands before God to haggle, to plead for Sodom and Gomorrah. And remember that Sodom and Gomorrah is not primarily about sexuality, it is about human violence, a point that is often not recognized in the churches. And Abraham is saying, far be it from you to do this. In other words, if I can find 100 good men, he says, will you spare the city? Oh, all right, says God. So he goes off and he can't find 100. So he comes back. If I can find just 10 good men, he beats God down. Well, in the end, he's not able to find any. But what you kind of have there is a sense of humanizing God. And a rabbi who was a professor in the University of Florida made the point to me that in one of the earliest Jewish texts, it is not Abraham that stands before the Lord, it is the Lord that stands before Abraham. In other words, the human is calling the divine to account. And therefore, what it means to be God is an interplay between the divine and the human, and what it means to be human is likewise the same interplay.
We're running short on time. I'm so really sorry, I'm going to ask the last question because I really just want you to leave us with a sense of this. We are in this time of crisis, and hope can feel naive sometimes, but how do you understand hope, and what spiritual practices ground you and give you the most nourishment at the moment? Very briefly.
Well, I come across so many burnt-out activists or sold-out activists who started off really radical and just totally disillusioned for completely understandable reasons. But the way I look at it, I think if you've got a spiritual perspective, you don't look at things just in this moment of time. You look at it from the perspective of time, as Plato called it, a moving image of eternity, a small window on eternity moving along. And if you take that point of view, we're part of a far bigger process than just our action in this moment in time. We're part of cosmological process. And I say to folk, I say to such fellow activists, which would you rather? Would you rather to be living on a planet where all the social justice and all the planetary sustainability and beauty of ecology and so on is perfectly intact? And we can just, swing in our hammocks all day and say, isn't it beautiful, and be like angels with their harps and clouds. Would you rather spend your life in that situation? Or would you rather be on the front line where the struggle is going on, where people are confused, where people are disillusioned, where people are hurting? And it might be planetary hospice work, but we can be participants in that work. And we can draw beauty out, like this window behind us, from the fragments of glass from a bomb, beauty made out of it again and again and again. Which would you rather be? It's not for me to answer that for their lives, but I know for me, I find meaning where the need is, where the call is. Where the call is to follow God's calling.
Alastair, thank you so much for all of the wisdom that you shared. Alastair is going to be with us all the rest of today. He's part of the panel tomorrow, so I do encourage you to come and ask him for one of his fancy devices here and enter into conversation with him and continue to ask your questions. Please give a warm round of applause to Alastair. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alastair. Thank you, Becca. That was really wonderful. So I just want to announce the next couple of events now. We've got in the tent, we're welcoming back our former director, Justine Huxley, who will be giving a workshop on aligning the seasons. And here in the nave, we've got the Human Library. So if you'd like to take part in that, that'll be an opportunity to have listen to various amazing speakers tell their stories in the nave and in the garden in much more small, intimate groups. So if you'd like to take part in that, please do pick up a catalogue on your way out, look through the list of titles, pick a couple of stories that you like the look of, and then come back in 15 minutes when we begin, and the librarians will direct you to the correct library book. So we've got 15 minutes before anything else happens, and look forward to seeing you